Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources, the articles, the research you send us, and really try to pull out the most important bits of knowledge and insight. So today we're doing something genuinely unique, and I should probably warn you, it's pretty provocative stuff we're looking at. We're going to unpack a very specific set of source materials that offer this, well, fascinating, almost seismic perspective on what's happening globally right now. Our mission really is just to distill the core arguments from this material. It's mainly drawing from excerpts of a YouTube video transcript. It's called Game Over, How Trump's EU Deal Just Broke the Global Elite, and it's from a channel called Promethean Updates. So the big question this deep dive is trying to answer, looking through the lens of this source, is this. How are recent political and economic moves, especially those involving Donald Trump, being framed as fundamentally challenging, the established global order and traditional ways of thinking?
Yeah, and it's really important, I think, to go into this knowing that the source offers a very, very distinct interpretation of events. It's definitely got a particular lens it's using. Our goal isn't to say, yes, this is right, or no, this is wrong. It's really just to understand this perspective deeply, to see what insights it offers into how some people are viewing these big shifts in the world. We're here to explore its logic, its claims.
Exactly. And believe me, there are some surprising claims in here. We'll be digging into what this source calls a stunning EU trade deal. Also, a really radical reevaluation of geopolitical alliances, pointing fingers in some unexpected directions, and a really surprising take on economics that basically says traditional experts have got it fundamentally wrong. Okay, let's get into it. Let's jump straight into this first big piece, what the source describes as Donald Trump's stunning trade deal with Ursula von der Leyen and the European Union. Now, this deal, we're told, isn't just a deal. It represents a fundamental break in the globalist order. I mean, that's a huge assertion, right? What makes this deal so significant from this viewpoint?
Well, what's interesting is the setup the source provides first. Kind of paints the EU as the final defender for the globalist policy of using free trade to crush the United States. That's the framing. And then it contrasts this with the actual outcome. They highlight Mark Gittenstein, who's Biden's ambassador to the EU. He reportedly said earlier this year that von der Leyen and the EU would, quote, hold the line against Trump's policies.
Where?
So the core takeaway for this source is that the exact opposite happened. And it happened in a way that, they argue, signals a much deeper vulnerability in that system.
Right, and the concessions they detail sound pretty specific. European markets supposedly opening up to U.S. manufacturing, agricultural goods, things that hadn't happened before, and the EU paying a minimum 15% tariff to import into the U.S.
Exactly. And those specifics lead the source to a really provocative conclusion, that this deal actually calls into question the very reason for the EU to continue to exist. This is pretty strong stuff. It basically frames the whole idea of the EU's collective protection as a kind of fairy tale, suggesting member nations surrendered their sovereignty for a benefit that just didn't materialize in this negotiation. They even say the EU did worse than the UK did in its own separate talks with Trump. So the nugget here is that the source sees this not just as a trade deal, but as like an exposure of the EU's fundamental weakness.
And the source ties this partly, at least, to Trump's reported negotiation style, describing it as operating from sovereignty, nation to nation, based on mutual benefit and respect for sovereignty. It gives examples like Japan apparently investing $500 billion in the U.S. and progress with China. What's the old way, the historical context that this style is supposedly rejecting?
Well, the source characterizes the past few decades as basically economic warfare disguised as free trade,
Right.
conducted through what it calls these imperial intermediaries like the EU and, globalist bureaucracies. The video states it pretty bluntly. Trump has thrown that playbook into the trash, and the EU crumbled. So the insight they're offering is that the previous system, built on these intermediaries, was maybe inherently unstable when someone just dealt directly nation to nation.
Okay, so if the EU deal is presented as one crack, the source argues it's not just isolated, it's part of this bigger picture, suggesting that a whole system of British philosophical liberalism itself is failing. What exactly does the source mean by British philosophical liberalism, and why do they think it's failing?
So the source seems to define the system as one that prioritizes abstract things, like financial gain and these global structures, over, say, tangible production and the sovereignty of individual nations. It even brings in a quote from Edward Luce. He's the U.S. national editor for the Financial Times, and his father was apparently Lord Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth, where Luce admits to Western liberalism's waning star. right? And the source grabs onto that admission, pairs it with the EU's supposed capitulation, and argues that this whole globalist system simply cannot compete when it's faced with a leader operating on principles of sovereignty and mutual development. Now, the perspective here is that this system lacks real substance, that it relies on manipulation and coercion rather than inherent strength. That's a core idea they're putting forward.
And this perspective then unpacks what it sees as Trump's direct challenge to those traditional geopolitical methods. It quotes him, standing next to British Prime Minister Starmer, saying something like, "If I weren't around, you'd have right now 6 major wars going on." And he gives that example, apparently, of getting India and Pakistan to settle differences in 24 hours by linking trade directly to stopping the conflict. What's the source trying to highlight about his methods there? How does that contrast with the system it says is failing?
Well, what really stands out in this analysis is how the source criticizes the talking heads, the commentators. It claims they just ignore this kind of direct, maybe pragmatic conflict resolution. Instead, the source says they focus on things like, shortened Russian sanctions or blaming the Gaza situation on Trump. It suggests these commentators kind of make their living off endless commentaries that actually distract from the real power dynamics. It's basically dismissing conventional analysis.
Yeah, that's a strong critique. And this is where the geopolitical stuff gets really, really interesting, according to this source. They bring in Nikolai Patrushev. Now, he's described as a former high-ranking Russian intelligence and security guy, a senior aide to Putin. And they bring him in regarding what the source calls British provocations in the Baltic Sea, supposedly designed to pit Russia against the U.S. Why bring him and these remarks into it? What's the significance there?
Exactly. It's a very specific reference. The source quotes Patrushev talking about London's abundant experience of false flag operations and includes his warning that London would easily backstab Washington, too. Patrushev is quoted saying, "I take it the White House is aware of what sort of ally they are dealing with." So the implication from this source is pretty clear. There's supposedly a deeper hidden game being played, where historical alliances might not be what they seem and conflicts might actually be engineered by, unexpected players.
And this ties back, in the source's narrative, to Trump's own comments about Russia. Specifically, his view that sanctions won't work that well anyway, and his belief that the whole Russia hoax, that's the term the source uses, referring to the election interference investigations, actually made it harder to deal with Putin, implying it created unnecessary friction. So putting all that together, what's the source's core argument about U.S.-Russia relations then?
Synthesizing this viewpoint, the source basically argues the real issue is not between the United States and Russia. Instead, it points the finger at what it calls British-guided forces that ran Russiagate, and it claims continue to perpetuate dangerous crises, like in Ukraine and the Middle East. The source is really firm on this. It believes Trump is consciously using his own playbook, not the British Empire's, and that in doing so, he's actually ending the era of geopolitics. So the key takeaway, the really bold claim, is that Trump is seen as deliberately dismantling this long-standing manipulative geopolitical strategy that the source attributes directly to British influence.
Wow. Okay, let's shift gears then to domestic economic policy. The source claims Trump has also thrown out the British playbook on domestic economic policy, and it notes the reaction. The British press, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal are beside themselves. That sounds like a strong reaction. What specifically does the source claim these establishment figures got wrong?
Well, this perspective argues pretty forcefully that the predictions coming from establishment economists or media, predictions of recession, skyrocketing prices because of Trump's tariff policies were, from its point of view, just demonstrably wrong, flat out incorrect.
Yeah.
And it cites evidence like tariffs are working, the trade deficit is shrinking, the U.S. apparently had a budget surplus back in June. It even points to Reuters reportedly admitting the U.S. goods trade deficit shrinks and likely boosts to second quarter GDP. Okay. So the nugget here is the source's argument that the traditional economic models completely failed to predict the positive outcomes it attributes to these policies.
Okay, so why? Why does the source claim these experts were so wrong? It argues they were making all of their calculations based on the methods of British liberal economics, which it says focuses just on money as the key metric. And it lumps together both Keynesian approaches, focusing on government spending, and Austrian school ideas like fiscal austerity. It sounds like the source is fundamentally criticizing both of those dominant schools of thought.
Exactly right. It sees them both as part of the same flawed British system focused only on money. And this leads us to what the source calls American economics, which it claims Trump's administration is bringing back. It quotes the U.S. Trade Ambassador, Jamieson Greer, reportedly giving a speech where he said something like, our trade deficit with China went down, our dependence on China went down, our real median household income went up during the first term, all linked to this robust trade policy. The source uses this as practical proof of a different economic philosophy actually working.
And they give it historical roots, too, right? Pointing back to Alexander Hamilton advocating for tariffs and Henry Clay's American system with its focus on protective tariffs. The source is basically saying, look, this isn't new. This has been part of American fabric for a long time, implying recent decades were the aberration.
Yeah, that's the historical angle. And what's also interesting is the source mentioning the ongoing administration continuing smackdown with the Federal Reserve. It includes Trump's comments on GDP, like reportedly seeing Q2 GDP at 3% and saying the Fed must now lower the rate, no inflation.
Hmm.
And it also points to proposals, apparently, to restructure the Fed and the American banking system, specifically to support productive lending. So, again, this suggests a deliberate effort to realign the whole financial system away from just money manipulation towards what it sees as productive economic activity.
So let's try and summarize the core philosophical contrast the source is drawing here. On one side, you've got what it labels the British system. This system, according to the source, worships money as an end in itself, treats people mainly as consumers rather than producers, and operates on this idea that for one nation to prosper, another must suffer, which it calls insane and criminal. I mean, that's incredibly strong language.
It is. And then on the other side, the force presents the American system. This system, it says, operates on totally different principles. Wealth comes from production, not looting. It understands that technological progress and rising productivity benefit everyone, and that developing human creative potential is what actually creates abundance. The source wraps up this section by stating its belief that fundamentally, universal principles always defeat lies and manipulation in the end. So the insight here is this really stark, almost moral division between two economic worldviews. One based on perceived scarcity and zero-sum competition, the other on potential abundance and cooperation through actual production.
What a unique and frankly intense perspective this source material gives us. It's really not just claiming a change in policy, is it? It's claiming a fundamental shift in the organizing principles of civilization itself. That's a huge vision this video is putting out there.
It really is, and the source hammers this home, reiterating its view that the empire is flinching because they know the game is up. That's the language it uses.
Oh.
It claims this empire just can't compete with policies based on what the source calls reality and universal principles. So it claims they have to resort to trying to manipulate, coerce, and create artificial crisis. The underlying message is pretty clear. A system built on perceived falsehoods, as the source sees it, will inevitably crumble when faced with policies grounded in, well, fundamental truths.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it definitely leaves us with a provocative thought, doesn't it? Building directly on this source material's core message. If these sources happen to be correct, and if reality has a way of asserting itself, as they put it, what could the long-term implications actually be for how nations deal with each other? How might our whole understanding of global power need to shift? What new opportunities or maybe challenges could emerge if these fundamental organizing principles really are shifting in the way this source suggests? Definitely something to think about as you watch events unfold.